been building, fixing and tinkering with electronics since the early 80s, from building my ZX80, dismantling my speak and spell big tracks, VIC-20 and generally making more mistakes than I can count, and building my own computers from the 286 to 486, and then moving over to other areas such as Trinitron and CRTs, and generally fixing, updating, fiddling and repairing things over the years, some which I've put up on the channel and some which are still to come. CRTs are a big passion of mine as they're still the best way to play retro content, and even older computers like the Speccy, the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64. But modern PCs are more prevalent, so let's get into building a brand new PC. Now in this video I will show you the actual build process, how to build your own PC from scratch, 2 complete systems I use for my test rigs, a medium to high end and then a top end machine for long-term value in life. For more on what is best for you, the cost and performance target, best for your pocket, aims and use cases through 2026, 27 and beyond, check out my other video which covers the choices, results and details for all if you want to go PC, add it to your repertoire or upgrade an aging rig. I decided to put this video together to cover things such as building a brand spanking new PC. So let's start with the basics. Before you do anything, make sure you get all of the hardware lined up and tick it off on a list if you've never done this before. It's really frustrating and it can happen to the best of us when you get through building a machine and realise, oh no, I don't have something like an SSD or even the CPU or even the PSU. It's very, very easy to forget everything that's needed to get a PC booted and up and running. So the worst case scenario is you have to take something apart or you have to go back to the shop to get the things that you missed. In the modern age, that means online delivery because you can't just pop to local retailers and stores because it just isn't as easy or as cheap as it used to be. So once you've got everything lined up, make sure you tick it off on the list. And this is important things such as the fan. Now, a lot of CPUs do come with an OEM fan inside the box, so long as you choose it. My 5800X 3D here doesn't, so you can choose to upgrade that to a secondary fan or replace it with what I've got here, a liquid cooler which sits externally on the case or at least somewhere else within the case to minimize the amount of area over the CPU next to the GPU, but it's entirely your choice. If you're on a budget, then don't spend an extra £90, £100 or something like this because it's going to be overkill. The standard fans that come with CPUs, they're pretty good unless you're going to go overclocking, then you are going to need something a little beefier. So once you've got everything lined up, make sure you've got the motherboard, the memory, the CPU, the PSU that at least hits around 750 to 800 watt. That's what I would recommend as a minimum in this day and age. A decent modern motherboard, so that's an AM4, AM5 motherboard minimum, unless you're going for an Intel board, and then go for the most you can afford, or at least one that fits inside the case with a little bit of space. Get everything lined up, and then there's 2 modes of operation here. You can either fit as much as you want on the motherboard outside of the case. If it's your first time, I wholly recommend you do this. It's very easy to leave a motherboard sitting on the case. Make sure you earth yourself if possible by touching the frame for a few seconds and then touch the motherboard. Don't go away and come back and touch the motherboard because static electricity, although it's overrated on the online world where everyone feels like they're some kind of raiding enemy, you can blow circuits quite easily with a lot of static if you're sitting on carpets, rubbing your feet. So just make sure you earth yourself quite regularly. And again, leave the motherboard sitting on the frame. That will give it a nice standard earth. And you can hook everything up outside of the case and make sure it all works before you then shut it down, disconnect it, and then fit it inside the case. That's my recommended mode of operandi. If you're new to this, I would certainly recommend how you do it. For me, I've been doing this for years. I can just go straight to putting it in the case and connecting everything up, which is what you'll see in the next stage. But again, choose the options you want that are most preferable to you and make sure you've got a nice, clean, flat surface to work in with good lighting so you can see everything you need easily. And make sure you've got a few screwdrivers and a pair of pliers just in case you need them, because you will on occasion. So once you've got the motherboard resting on the box with the plastic behind it on the case, you can then take the CPU. The CPU is very simple, certainly AMD and Intel. There tends to be a little corner cut off and a little triangle, a gold triangle, which matches up to the same line on the motherboard socket as well. So turn it around so that that little corner that's cut off can just drop into the box itself. The little pins that hold it, they'll only go in one way. So don't make any force, don't push down on the CPU. You just need to drop it in when it's lined up. Put it on top, just push it across with your finger left and right, and it will slowly just drop into the holes. Give it a wiggle to make sure that all of them are in straight and there's no problems, and then pull the bar down, and that will lock in the CPU into the motherboard. So next we want to put the memory in. Again, best to do this out of the case if it's your first time. And most memory is dual socketed, so it's pairs. And you put it in the odd or the even slot. So not next to each other. You want to put it in the first and third or the second and fourth. So most motherboards are configured this way. Just check, but I'll be surprised you find one that's different. Obviously you can also get quad core memory, but that'll be Intel specifically. For standard, it's going to be dual paired in the motherboard. Plop them in, odds and evens. Looking at the board here, you can see there's 4 memory slots for the DIMMs for the DDR. So you just drop them into the second one and the fourth one away from the CPU going outwards. You can see I'm just pushing it in there. And again, they'll only go in one way. There'll be a little bar that goes in, and the actual sockets themselves will have a little split in the middle. On modern DDR4, DDR5 slightly different. And they'll go in one way. You push down slightly to one side, get it lined up, and then give it a good push from the top, and it'll click in one side, click in the other. You know it's done. You don't need to move those bars. If they're not clicking in, you got it in the wrong way around, or you're not lined up. And this is why I recommend, if it's your first time, do it outside of the case, because it's easier, it gives you more space and light. It might look a bit awkward, but it's the best thing. Once that's done, finally the last piece will probably be the SSD. That's that little socket there. You can see, you unscrew it, slide in the SSD, the NVMe SSD, click it in, put the heatsink back on, and then put the retaining bolt underneath to support the actual SSD itself, and screw that in. Look at my PS5 swapping your SSD, it's exactly the same. And once that's done, the board is then ready to go into the case. You've really got to go in at this point and fit the rest of it in, so let's move into that section. So here you'll need to go back to the motherboard box you've got, and inside there will be a backing plate, and this is the I/O plate, the input output plate that comes with your specific motherboard. Now on your case of choice, whether it be ATX, micro ATX, whatever, there'll be a little fixed cutout slot. Sometimes there's a piece of standard metal in there. You can just push that out of the way, and you take the one that comes with the motherboard and you simply push it into slot so it clips in. There's no screws needed, it just squeezes itself into that position. At that point, you've then got your motherboard slot ready to align to all the input-output ports that are on your specific motherboard that you've bought, because obviously they're different per board. The next thing you need to do, depending whether you've got an ATX board, a micro ATX board, or whatever, you'll need to then change the retaining pins that are already fitted into your board. And these can be quite tight and very well fitted. They're usually like a gold brass colour, so you just get a pair of pliers, unscrew the ones where you need to line it up to the holes on your motherboard, and just adjust them. They'll be prefixed, and sometimes they're marked to say whether they're MNTX or ATX or whatever. You just move them to the relevant points. It's usually the ones lower down you need to move, like I have here, a micro ATX. You just fit it in, screw those into the board, and then you sit the motherboard on top of those pins, and you'll see they'll align up to like 4 or 5 holes in the board itself. And then you just take the actual screws that come with your motherboard. There'll be a bag of loads of them, and it's usually the flathead ones, slightly short with like a curved head. Sometimes they come with a little washer, soft velvet washer that sits between the board to stop any earthing, and you just screw those in and secure the board into place. Before you do that though, make sure you wiggle the board into the I/O slot. There'll be some retaining metal clips that go in there, so just make sure they're out of the way. They're bent backwards or bent forwards, just so nothing's catching. You don't have a metal piece sticking into your USB port, which can cause you problems later on. So do all that, try all that, get it all ready and working, and then screw everything down so it's nice and snug and fit, and it should then move. You wobble it around, it should be fixed into the case itself, and there you're good to finish off the next stages. So the next piece is really around cooling, and if you've got an OEM fan that came with your CPU, then as you can see on the socket itself, you tend to just clip these in either side. So they tend to have a retaining pin, like a bracket that goes between the fan. You clip one side in easily, and then you put force on the other side, bend it around the pin, and it clips into place. So before you do that, you'll have to do the important part of applying the heatsink paste. What you need to do here is just to annoy the comment section down below. You need to get as much thermal paste as you can and just whack it all over the heatsink die, so that all of that contact is completely smothered in the thermal paste. And obviously, as we all know, the more thermal paste is, the cooler your CPU is. Obviously, I'm joking. I'm sure everyone's going to be angry in there. This is always going to be a point of contention for people What I tend to do is a little blob in the middle and then 2 blobs around the edge and then press it down. The thing about thermal paste is you don't need loads, and it does spread out and fills in the gaps. That's what it's there for. All it really does is remove any air gaps, because air gaps are bad when it comes to thermal dissipation and heat dissipation. You don't want air gaps because that creates a hot pocket, and it will therefore means that heat isn't being dissipated from the unit and the CPU out through any cooling mechanism you've got. And obviously water is considerably, factors 10, 20 times more thermal conductive than air. So it's a much better solution to use liquid water than anything else, which is why it's used in, hot water bottles to thermos, because it's just the best thing to use. So fundamentally, if you can use it, you don't need to. If you're using a standard OEM, just fit that, clip it in, put the CPU socket on, connect the power up, and away you go. You can skip most of this part. So here I'm actually using a secondary reservoir water cooler. As I mentioned before, you can choose to do this. It adds additional cooling options if you want to do overclocking. It can also help ventilation and lower the overall heat inside your case, because it gives the actual unit itself more headroom, and then airflow can run over your units easier and out of the case using your exhaust fans. And there's various elements. So this is a little more involved than doing it from the standard OEM fans, which is very, very simple. That actually fits together similar to what you're seeing now, which is the heatsink part, the connector, the thermal connector that sits on the CPU. So here you just take the clip that comes with it. There's 2 types, one for an AMD and one for an Intel. They clip in, and those retaining pins there, they're exactly the same as the standard OEM one. They fit over the actual socket itself, and you can see these little arms that come with it. Put them into the hole. They then screw in with these little retainer brackets. They go on top, and you turn them and tighten them down. You push underneath. Make sure you remove the little film that's over the heatsink as well, because otherwise you'll end up having plastic between metal, and that won't work. So you can see it to the left there. And then just clip it in. So basically just push them down on the board, and they'll clip underneath those arms I mentioned earlier. And then you put the retaining pin on top, and you screw it down by hand and get it nice and tight and firm. Do both sides, and then tighten it up as firm as you can. Not over tighten, don't go mad, but just hand tighten so that it's pulling down against the CPU socket as thermally as possible. And that will push out all that thermal paste you put in earlier, and you'll get a nice even contact. And that thermal paste will then allow all that heat to be dissipated straight through the heatsink and then straight into the reservoir here, or straight into your CPU cooler, whichever you've got. At this point, we're then going to go into the second part, which is basically fitting the fans to the reservoir and then fitting the reservoir to the case, which is, again, like I say, over the top. If you've only got a standard OEM fan, you can skip all of this to the next section. So the reservoir comes with 2 separate cooling fans, which also have LEDs. I'm not a big fan, but I'll show them anyway. So these just fit to the reservoir itself to basically get airflow over the reservoir to help that cooling as it's circulating water through the reservoir back through the pump, and that constantly runs at all times. So these have just 4 pins on there, and they screw into the case. And then if you've got a standard case with a ventilation gap at the top, you can then screw these fans onto the reservoir, and then you screw the reservoir to the case, and then you've got this nice airflow going up and out of your case. For me, this one's fitting to the front. I'm not going to spend an even higher amount of money on a case that has these built in. I'll just cut out one myself, get a little gauze filter, put that at the front, and then exhaust it. But I'll show you it fitting here. So what you do is you take the reservoir and you feed it through the slot where the optical drive would be. So you do this before you fit everything. So leave the fans off, push the reservoir through to the front. Don't connect anything else at this point. It's easier doing this than the other way around, which is fitting the reservoir and then pushing the heatsink through and then attaching it. You can do that. I find that awkward because if you start twisting it, you can end up putting pressure on the braided hoses, which you don't want to do. So fit that to the front of the case, and the way it works is the fan sandwiches in the case. So you basically have the fans on the inside, the reservoir on the outside, and you squash them together against the frame itself and you screw them in. The way to do this is to take the pins, put all 4 pins into the fans on the inside, and then push them through the case so they're protruding, so you can see them at the front. The front of these cases pops off. Most cases do. You can see them all sticking out. And then what you do is you take the reservoir and you put the top left here, you line that one, and just finger tighten with your thumb for now just to get it lined up, and then you do the bottom right. The reason you do that is it's just symmetrical. So you line them all up, and once those 2 are aligned, all the other screw holes will be aligned to the frame. So it means all your protruding screws then, it's just a case of wiggling through the hole and then again finger tighten them, and then go again left to right, top to bottom, back and forth, so that you're tightening everything up evenly. When you're finished and it's all done, then just get your screwdriver head and just tighten everything up. Again, just like the heatsink on the CPU, just tighten it with a screwdriver too. Not over tighten, but just tight enough to, there's a bit of resistance there, a little bit of torque, and then you can, when you feel that point, stop. Don't over tighten things on cases and motherboards. That's happened before. People can crack things. If you're a bit heavy handed, you can easily do it. So once that's all tight, all the fans are in, everything's clipped together, you've now got all of your reservoir at the front, you've got your nice heatsink attached to the CPU. We then need to move to the PSU and the cable tidy, a very important part of having a case you want to look inside when it's turned on. So fit your PSU in here. It's the bottom facing down with the fan exhaust facing down. This tower's got a little external filter which you can slide in and out to keep dust and dirt out. Once that's done, you take your Molex connectors. Modular this one is, so you get some sound like Yoda then. So effectively you get some fixed cables and then modular cables which you can add into the rails on top. Never mix up rails and cables from other PSUs. Use the ones that come with it. You can create issues, fire, all that kind of damage, so don't do that. But fit everything in against the relevant power sources you've got specific to your CPU, motherboard and all that. I'm not going to go into that here, but you'll see it's pretty simple. You've got a CPU power, an ATX power. You'll have your 8-pin dual connectors for your GPU. And then on top of that, you'll have the connectors coming from the board. So you'll have things like the speakers, the power on, the reset switch, the USB, all of that has standard headers that just clip into the points on the motherboard specific to the motherboard. It's not like the old days, which I kind of miss in some ways, where you used to have, you know, individual pins to the jumpers on the boards. The headers used to go straight in wire by wire, which could sometimes be very fiddly. And then you'd have like the jumpers and you'd have to cap those off and join them up to run the certain frequencies of the board or even run a certain CPU at all. And that's a certain point we'll get to in a minute in terms of a modern issue. Before all that though, the most important thing is tidy as you go. Top tip. So as you go, take the motherboard box and everything you don't use, put it back in there. So if you've got a spare SATA, a spare cable, your PSU, put all your additional modular cables in that box. Do it as you go, because then when you're hunting around later on for a cable you need, or a SATA cable you need an extra one, or you broke one, you'll find it because it'll be in the place where you put it. So do it as you go. Very important. So next, it's the GPU, which will be the biggest thing you'll stick in your case, certainly nowadays if you've got something of a modern size here. I'm using an RTX 3080, so it's monstrous, takes up dual cards. The first thing you need to do is on the back of the case, just pop off those retaining slides that sit in there. They're metal and they push out, they just basically snap off, and then you'll have this kind of retaining plate which sits above it most of the time. You just unscrew that and slide it up, then take your GPU and push it into the AGP slot. Sorry, modern day PCIe Express, where we went backwards and forwards. It used to be PCIe, then AGP, then back to PCIe. You slot that in. Again, you just push out the retaining clip on the board, and then you push the socket into that board itself, and it will just clip in, and the actual clip itself will pop back up, and it will slide into the two plates you've given yourself the space for, and then take your dual 8-pin power cables and plug them into the board itself. So it's taking power from the board and also from those cables, because they draw so much power now. They're incredibly power hungry, these modern GPUs. You need all that. Make sure you take the time to balance this out and just, again, give it a good push, not too hard, but it will just clip in and click, and you'll hear it slot into place. At that point, align your screw and screw it back into the frame, and then you should have all of your main components in now, ready to go. At this point, you probably want to power it on and test that everything's working before you go mad and do all your cable tidies. Don't worry at this point if nothing works. The worst thing that can happen is you power it on and it beeps at you, or it doesn't power on at all. If it doesn't power on at all, then you've got to run through your fault finding, which will be simple. So the KISS model, keep it simple, stupid. Always go through, you know, have you got all the right power cables in? Have you turned the PSU on at the back? Common one. Have you even plugged it in at the wall? All those basic stuff before you start running around taking cables out and messing around. At that point, if you're getting a display to screen and some sound, it might not be installing or anything, you can then safely cable tidy. So the main rule here is if you have got an external reservoir, as you see here, then run those at the back. Run any cable you can around the back side of the board where the motherboard and the case fits together, because that's the tidiest place to put cables. So run at the back, use any cable tidies or zip ties, and just clip them in and then wrap them up as tight as possible, and then just tie them to the little loopholes you'll find across the case itself. Do that as much as you can to keep things tidy and out of the way, neat and tidy, so you don't catch things if you take things in and out of the case. And like I say, as much as you can, run it across the top or at the back, and that keeps things as neat and tidy, and you don't see all those cables. There really isn't much of an art form to cable tidy. You need to do it, you need to spend the time to do it, but run it out of view as much as possible. And then at that point, you can boot up. And this is where you'll get like modern day issues. So most CPUs have newer architecture coming out quite regularly, every couple of years. So this particular board didn't have or didn't support the 5800X 3D. Luckily, it did boot. It gave you a message saying it knows that CPU is in there, but it runs in like a fail state, a fallback, architectural fallback, which means you don't get all the functionality of it. It won't be able to read all the cache that's in there and all the other benefits, and it doesn't run at the full clock speed. So you have to update it. Now, sometimes you can't even boot from that, and some modern CPUs now have the option to be able to boot to the USB stick. You download the latest BIOS, you stick it on a USB stick, you hold down a button on the board for an easy flash. It'll then boot from that USB, update the BIOS, it'll keep flashing away, and when it's finished, you can then just boot it again and it'll work off your new CPU. That's great if you've installed a CPU and realized you don't have it. If you haven't got that option, then you are a little bit screwed. You then have to either boot without a CPU, again, some will let you do that, or you boot with an older CPU, update it as you see here using this version, and then once it's updated, you can then use the new CPU. Here I had to update to the latest version. There was quite a few updates, but out of the box, this MSI board didn't support the 5800X 3D, so I updated it so it could. The BIOS was updated, it fully supported it, and I could then go and use it as needed. The final part is obviously installing the latest version of Windows. For me, Windows 10, there's no way I'm going to 11. I've got quite a few copies of Windows 10 from previous work, so I've got loads of them. It's very easy though to pick up a code online, or if you've got an OEM machine, sometimes you can just transfer an old machine. So if one's died, you can actually log in with your account, link it, and then still use that same Windows 10 key, basically take it off the old machine, use it on the new machine. So just be aware that you don't have to go and buy a new one if you've got an old one kicking around. But if you have, then go and jump online, 15, 20 quid. Will get you a Windows 10 key, and then you can install it as per usual, do a fresh install, get everything running on the SSD. Use an SSD at least for the operating system, because that makes a huge difference on boot up times and just basic operation. And then once in, you can then play around with the hardware as needed, and to your heart's content. But overall, this is how you build and put together your own PC. There are some other points in terms of just extra tidying I did at the back, and obviously the front part that I did on the case, which I haven't videoed for this particular part, but I will do to show that in a future video for modding effectively. It's entirely up to you. And the final piece is the fact that you don't have to go Windows. You know, you've got the option nowadays to go Linux, thanks to SteamOS, which is not available on desktops, but it's coming, absolutely going to come. That's 100% guaranteed. But you've got other options like Bazzite, Nabara, Chimera, and I think that they're all largely based on Fedora, I believe, but they're the best options you can get. Bazzite's probably the easiest, but it gives you the option to be able to just say, do you know what, I'm not going to go Windows, I'm going to go to Linux, and you can still do all things like gaming and stuff, but again, I'll cover that in a separate video, which I've mentioned before. Final piece is the two specs that I built here, the difference between water-cooled and air-cooled, and some basic tweaks for the 5700, 5800X 3D CPUs, and any 3D CPU, or even any CPU you build in terms of your machine. Now, the high-end machine that I built here, this is a water-cooled 9800X 3D X870 ice board. It's rocking a 5080 or even a 5090. It's top end. It's the best gaming rig money can buy right now. And this is my test bed for games in 2026, 2027, and likely beyond. And you can check out my other video for the details on the price, performance, the deep dive between these two rigs, and some other configurations, and some other interesting comparisons and bits in that video. So do check that out when it's available for everybody, but it's up for patrons very, very soon. Now, the 5800X 3D machine is built to deliver kind of medium to high-end console beating levels. Now, although the 5800X 3D is harder to get now, the 5700X 3D is almost identical, and it's within 10% by and large. So if you go air or water cooled, you can just tweak the BIOS to kind of undervolt the CPU a little bit, and this is very, very important. Now, you should go into the AMD overclocking option in the BIOS, then go to the PBO option and the curve optimizer. You can see it on screen now. Now, you want to set the value to negative. Now, I wouldn't go any more than 30 as an absolute value. Setting says negative, so you don't put minus in this section, you just put 30. It knows that it's reduction of the overall voltage levels it can hit. But minus 30 is probably the best you're going to get, but I prefer to set it somewhere between 20 and 25. I tend to find that's the standard level that doesn't cause any issues, and that offers a decent power and thus heat reduction. And it also means that it maintains max clocks for longer, which means much, much better performance in heavy gaming loads and mass CPU games, such as The Last of Us 2, Dragon's Dogma 2, Helldivers 2, Battlefield 6, among many, many others that really, really hammer the CPU. So you want to do that, but also make sure you test it for a while, because even if you set it to minus 30, minus faulty, and you think, oh, it's working fine for 5 minutes, it can break later on when you're compiling work, when you're writing code, when you're rendering videos, and certainly playing games. So just make sure you give it a good thorough test for hours and hours before you say, do you know what, that is a setting that I can level it at. There are some other bits in terms of PBT and the power levels and the thermals and stuff, but I'm not going to go into that now. We'll do another video on that separately at some point in the future about how to get the best and configure settings on your Windows PC and others to get the best out of it. But realistically, that's also going to handle what your motherboard is that you bought, what CPU you've got, and therefore what options you've got within the BIOS itself. So again, I can't know what everyone's got. But using this CPU in CPU ID, this means that at idle, we sit around 28 to 30 degrees on desktop in Windows 10, and even under full max load, 4.5 gigahertz, we can stay below 70 degrees Celsius, which is excellent. And even at full load stress test for all cores max, and that's 5 minutes flat out, we're below 74 degrees, and that's at 4.45 gigahertz maintained. And effectively, this CPU in the CPU ID, it kind of compares and competes with a 9600X. Okay, so that's a non-X3D, that is, but that's a 6-core, 12-thread modern CPU compared to this one. And in gaming, in many gaming, when the code's not very good, that cache is actually going to push it significantly above. So the 5800, 5700X3D CPU cannot be under-egged. And let's be honest, the 9600 is only beating it because it's got a much higher base clock speed of like 5.5 gigahertz. So it's almost got a gigahertz boost on this. So that's really where that difference is coming from, not really from any major architectural changes. So this CPU still is great value for money, and certainly 5700X, which you can get for, sub £200. And all of this means that the one you're seeing now here is running on my Thermal Light Peerless air-cooled Assassin CPU, the V2 one, which you saw in the build, and it remains reasonably quiet and cool. In fact, it's as cool, but not quite as quiet as the prior MSI cooler that I had on it. But that kind of I had to remove as it died within like a year of building this in 2023, which is when this video first went up. This is an updated version for patrons. So I replaced that about a year in with this Peerless Assassin, and this has been absolutely faultless. And air cooling is more reliant than water cooling because there's less moving parts and all the complexity, but this is still superb for the 5800X 3D CPU, and it's far more power hungry than non-3D CPUs, and it's one of the hottest CPUs you can buy. Actually, it's one of the first 3D cache CPUs. That's why you need to do that undervolting, and again, you can see the comparisons on screen, but more in my other video. If you don't do it, you'll start throttling the CPU heavily in those games I mentioned and others where it really starts to hit the thermal limits of the CPU. So that's why I recommend that you do these tweaks and changes. But hopefully this video has given you a flavour of how simple and easy it is to build your own PC. Hopefully helpful for some that want to get into the PC space, upgrade their current PC, but were scared to do it themselves. And hopefully this shows how simple it really is. And obviously I always stress this, you can still do this in addition to having a console. You don't need to have only PC or only console, have whatever you can. And the last part is that top tip, as I said before, always make sure that when you finish, put all of your bits, your PCs, box them back up neat and tidy, put them back in the original case box that it came with, and just write on what it was and store it in the attic, in the cupboard, wherever it needs to go. You'll thank me later because it's always a helpful situation. In 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years time, you'll go back and there it will all be in one place. And this is kind of where I've grown up, not having much money, earning everything myself from a very young age. So I kind of take value in everything. I keep most things. I'm very, very reluctant to sell things. That's why I've got such a vast collection of retro hardware that didn't cost me an arm and a leg, which a lot of people do now. And hopefully this is another example of that, in terms of trying to share the wealth and hopefully help a lot of you out, not spending a fortune with these online companies that will give you a decent build, potentially, absolutely, yes, but you can do it yourself, you can save a fortune, and you know what you're getting the best hardware because you bought it, you picked it, you sourced it yourself. So again, remember, I'm completely self-funded and independent. Hopefully you found this video insightful, enjoyable, and it wasn't too boring, and I tried to do it at a pace that is comfortable for everyone. You can skip through it with a chapter selection below as needed. But as always, like, share, subscribe, comment and all that. I hate saying it, but it's the only way that gets YouTube algorithms to pick me up. And if you can help and support, I'll be putting more and more stuff this year on my Patreon for exclusive access, which this would have been far, far earlier for those, for a few weeks to get a benefit out of it. And there's much more on there now that I'm going to start adding this year to make sure that they get some good value out of it. So patrons get some more value out of that. Anyway, I'm out, but I'll catch you all very soon on the next one.